written law, California law, United States federal law, NRC to enforce. By law, have to have somewhere to put the cement fuel rods. They promised us they would have the cement fuel rods taken care of by 1976, then by 1982, then by 1985, then 1991. It's 2013, you still store them on site.
Live, this is One for the Record. I'm Diane, and today is March 11th, 2013. It is Monday. It is the 2-year anniversary of Fukushima, Daiichi, and the earthquake, and the meltdowns of the reactors. The worst nuclear industrial event that has ever happened to modern-day humanity. Alrighty then, just a quick rant. I am attaching the latest news, and then we're going to take a quick look back. So hold on to your seats. Now, my rant today would be, I have the solution to this whole nuclear industry situation. Number one, when I was a theater manager and we couldn't figure out what was going on, we would clear house. You can call it clean house. You can call it clear house. Clearing the house. Meaning you go in and you fire the whole crew, everything, everybody, and start fresh. Well, since we don't know how to handle Fukushima, we don't know why the nuclear industry wants to store fuel rods on top of their reactors. There's nothing but chaos happening, and out of the chaos we will have organization. Oh yes, and here's how we're going to do it. Since I have 2 masters and almost a 3rd one in public administration, let's consider this a free consultation. And with my years of management behind me, this is a free consultation. we will now fix the nuclear industry very easily. Number one, I'm gonna give an exception to the rule. We will fire everyone, no matter what position they are. If they are in the nuclear industry, the engineers, from the janitors on up to the executive board, to the stakeholders, to all of them, we are going to change hands now. And it will be to people who do not have anything to do with the nuclear industry. Number 2, the longevity, job stability. You think because you made these reactors so it takes 30 years to cool them down? Fine, but you aren't going to be the ones working at them anymore. No longer. What we need to do is fire them all. And that way I have just created possibly, maybe even 1 million. If we do this from around the world, we have created 1 million new jobs. In just simply 5 minutes. Because obviously these people are incompetent. I will say we need an exception to the rule. So we will keep Arnie Gunderson. He can be in charge of certain engineering and planning strategies. Alrighty then. Number 3. They're going to have to walk out, walk down, quit or be fired. And that's how it's going to be handled to them. I used to be nice enough to say you can quit now or be fired. It's up to you. You can walk down now or be fired and possibly charged with crimes against humanity. Because I don't know, it's really on the borderline of sooner or later you are going to be charged with something. So if I were you, I would hightail it out and get into some, take up the entertainment industry, do something else, go be a farmer, go be a scientist somewhere else. Because I'm going to tell you right now, across the board, all these people need to be let go. They just need to be let go. A total change of hands. From the ownership also. Ownership, the regulators, all of them. Everything needs to be created new. You don't want to shut them down, fine, but you're not going to be the ones running them. You're not going to be the ones making money off of them. No longer. Alrighty then. That is my quick solution in approximately 4 minutes and 57 seconds. Alright, stay tuned. I have a lot to cover. I am looking into the past. I want to reflect with you what we've all gone through from across the world. There's your solution. If they don't want to take the rods and get them off the planet, even though we have the technology, then out of chaos there is order. So now that there is chaos, they all need to be let go. All of them. From the high-ups to the down-belows. They all need to be... Anyone, or were you in the nuclear industry? You no longer work in that industry. Got it? Alrighty then. There's your solution. Take care. And stay tuned. It is 1 day down, 4 to go. 4 to go before the weekend. Even though we're right in the middle of it. Take care and please watch all the videos. It might bring back memories to you. And the most recent one is starting off first. From yesterday. Alright, take care. And as I said, always be prepared. And look at all the new jobs we're going to have now. Take care.
People in northeastern Japan have spent nearly 2 years getting over what they lost and in getting back on their feet. Next Monday marks the 2nd anniversary of the earthquake, tsunami and nuclear accident. The disaster killed nearly 16,000 people. About 2,700 others are still listed as missing. People across the northeast are moving forward on a path to recovery. They've worked to rebuild their homes, their communities and their lives. We'll be spending the lead up to March the 11th looking at how far they've come and the challenges that still lie ahead. And perhaps the biggest one is the damaged nuclear plant in Fukushima. Areas around the facility shown here in red are still off limits. About 160,000 people from Fukushima Prefecture are still unable to go home. The earthquake and tsunami triggered a total blackout at Fukushima Daiichi. Workers with Tokyo Electric Power Company were unable to keep the fuel inside the reactors cool. Meltdowns happened inside 3 of the facility's 6 reactors. The temperature of the fuel continued to rise. Hydrogen built up and sparked explosions. The blast damaged reactor buildings and released massive amounts of radiation into the environment. 2 years on, TEPCO officials say the situation is. Crews will one day dismantle and decommission the 4 crippled reactors. Japanese leaders have announced the entire operation could take up to 40 years. But TEPCO engineers admit they have no firm timeline and no firm plan for moving the molten fuel. But TEPCO engineers admit they have no firm timeline and no firm plan for moving the molten fuel. NHK World's Yoichiro Tateiwa spoke with the utility's top official in charge of nuclear power.
Akira Kawano has been an engineer at TEPCO for almost 30 years. He was in charge of safety at Fukushima Daiichi before the accident. Now he supervised the decommissioning process.
What do you think the most difficult part, the difficult element concerning the decommissioning process?
2 difficult challenges. The one is how to understand the inside the reactor pressure vessel and the primary containment vessel, and to remove the molten fuel debris from the unit 1 through 3. The other challenge is that how to cope with waste. It's a liquid waste and solid waste. How to treat them and how to safely store it for the long time.
TEPCO engineers are still trying to understand the situation inside the reactors. They are using fiber optic scopes and closed-circuit cameras to gather images of the damage. They are also using computer simulations to determine the condition of the molten fuel. But high levels of radiation are slowing things down. Workers can only go into reactor buildings for 5 to 10 minutes at a time.
We haven't understood well how those molten fuel debris are distributed and located. We need to sample the debris, and we need to understand the mechanical characteristics and chemical characteristics of the debris. So otherwise we cannot develop the necessary tool to retrieve the debris. I hope we'd like to understand something about it within a couple of years. It takes a long time it's difficult to achieve. It takes a time actually. So even just for the removal of the debris, and it takes 10 years or more, I think. And you know, the half-life of the for example, the cesium is 30 years. So at some part of the decommissioning, we need to wait. The radiation will be reduced.
There are different ways to decommission a nuclear plant, but they all involve risks. Given the state of Fukushima Daiichi, Kawano and his team need to account for unprecedented challenges when they choose options. He believes TEPCO executives will have to discuss it with stakeholders and explain the risks of the options before they decide what course of action they should take.
We really need to improve our capability of the risk communication in future. That's also our challenge. Regarding also the decommissioning, we need to share that information.
Another major issue, as Kawano mentioned, is the toxic waste on site at Fukushima Daiichi. Every day, 400 tons of groundwater seeps into the highly radioactive units. Engineers pump it from buildings and into special tanks. They're in a constant race to build enough storage capacity to prevent any leaks into the environment.
It's really impossible just to continuously accumulate that water in the tank. It's not a reasonable way. So we need to think about the possibility of discharge or the other alternative ways, like evaporation or something like that.
TEPCO engineers are planning to introduce a new device. They say it's capable of removing all radioactive isotopes from the water.
Okay.
Kawano says the manager needs to talk to local residents in order to decide how to resolve.
It is time to remove the incompetent and obsolete nuclear industry, which is in place right now. There must be a new industry, a nuclear energy, if we are to continue with nuclear energy. And may I suggest that I guess I could be the head of HR, because I know what this industry needs. A brand new crew that's not incompetent nor obsolete.
The 1 meter tall remote controlled robot can wash radioactive materials from walls and floors using high powered water jets. The water travels at several hundred times the pressure of tap water. The removed substances are sucked up by a vacuum at the tip of the robot's arm.
We hope our robot will improve the environment of the nuclear power plant and help with the recovery process.
Workers from Tokyo Electric Power Company have been struggling to decommission the reactors. They can enter the reactor building for only short periods because of high levels of radiation.
My favorite part was when everyone clapped. It was like something good was happening.
Tens of thousands of people in Taiwan have demonstrated against construction of the country's 4th nuclear power plant, which is located near Taipei. Protests took place on Saturday in 4 cities, including Taipei and Kaohsiung. The rallies were held to mark the 2nd anniversary of the nuclear disaster in Fukushima, Japan, which has further raised concerns among residents. Police say about 50,000 protesters marched from the presidential office in Taipei. The protesters chanted, "Reject dangerous nuclear power plants," and called for the suspension of the project.
We should abolish the 4th plant and let Taiwan become nuclear free.
Taiwan's 4th nuclear plant in New Taipei City has been hit by a series of problems since construction began in 1999. The project has been delayed by more than 10 years, partly because of a political dispute between the ruling and opposition parties. Taiwanese authorities are planning to hold a referendum on whether to continue construction of the country's 4th nuclear facility.
Next up, North Korea has successfully conducted their 3rd test into making a nuclear missile go
Japanese government officials are getting ready to tap natural gas called methane hydrate beneath the ocean floor for the first time ever in the world. The country is facing the rising costs of imported fuels, and the government is planning to start test drilling off Japan's Pacific coast as early as next week. Sources close to the project have told NHK that pipes for drilling are almost ready for installation. They say the gas field is located several hundred meters beneath the ocean floor, off the coast of Aichi Prefecture in central Japan. Methane hydrate is a type of natural gas that is formed from methane and water. The deposits in the area alone are estimated to be enough for covering the country's natural gas consumption for 14 years.
The North Korean Foreign Ministry issued a statement on Saturday through the state media 2 days after the UN Security Council unanimously approved the tightened sanctions in response to its 3rd nuclear test. It said the UN Security Council cooked up 5 sanctions resolutions against the North, but they only resulted in the country's bolstering of its nuclear deterrent, both in quality and quantity. The statement went on to say that the world will clearly see how the country will reinforce itself as a permanent nuclear weapons state and satellite launcher as a result of these sanctions. North Korea has declared it will scrap the 1953 armistice that ended the Korean War and nullify its non-aggression agreements with South Korea as of Monday. On that day, the U.S. and South Korea are scheduled to begin the second joint military exercise this month.
Written law, California law, United States federal law, NRC to enforce. By law, have to have somewhere to put the spent fuel rods. They promised us they would have the spent fuel rods taken care of by 1976, then by 1982, then by 1985, then 1991. It's 2013, you still store them on site.
The lunatic is on the grass. The lunatic is on the grass. Remember.
The Fukushima catastrophe is probably the worst nuclear disaster in human history. It's certainly worse than Chernobyl. The contamination from Fukushima has gone as far south as Tokyo. I have measured it personally in air filters from cars. At least 12 different air filters from cars were sent to me, some of them from the south of Tokyo, and many of them from 100 kilometers away from Fukushima. And they contain very large amounts of radioactivity in them, high levels of cesium-134 and cesium-137. So we can conclude without any doubt that that area, up to 200 kilometers, maybe more, away from the catastrophe site, has been seriously contaminated with radionuclides. Now, if the cars are breathing this material, then so are the people, and so are the children. And so the children will be contaminated with radioactivity. We've recently heard that the Japanese government have been doing whole body counting. That is to say, they've been putting some people inside a monitor to see how much cesium is inside them. And apparently the levels of cesium are sufficient for them to say that there's no problem, that there are not going to be any increases in ill health. At the same time, I hear reports from Japan, from mothers of children, who say that they're showing all of the signs of contamination with cesium that were also found by my colleague Professor Yuri Bandashevsky after Chernobyl in the areas of Belarus that were contaminated similarly with this substance, cesium-137. And what it did there was that it went into the heart muscle and it caused conduction difficulties and destroyed heart muscle. So the children in Belarus were suffering heart attacks and arrhythmias. That's when the heart doesn't beat properly. And of course later on in life they die young from heart disease because the heart cells don't replicate themselves. The heart cells, you get all of your heart cells at once. You get maybe 1% increase in heart cells per year. But over the period of time we're talking about, there's going to be no replacement for the cells that were damaged by the Fukushima catastrophe in the children. So we have two different points of view here. We have the point of view of the Japanese government, who are ignoring it, who are making these superficial measurements of cesium in the whole bodies of the children and the people, and are saying that these concentrations are not sufficient to cause any problems. Well, of course, this is an argument that's going on and on. It's like a tennis match, goes backwards and forwards. You know, the independent scientists say there's a problem, and the government and the nuclear scientists say there's no problem. Of course, the real problem is that we have to do something about it. I mean, I am a father. I have 7 children. I have 11 grandchildren. And I can't sit back and just let this go on with us in some sort of silly tennis match between us and the pro-nuclear scientists who are trying to save the industry from collapse. And all the time the children are getting more and more sick, and they're building up this level of radioactive damage, which will result in them getting sick and dying with cancer, heart disease, whole range of illnesses that were all discovered after Chernobyl. And it's not as if this is something new. We know what's going to happen. We absolutely know what's going to happen. We have looked very closely at the health effects of people who were exposed to these same radionuclides after the Chernobyl accident in the same quantities. Not as many people, I have to say, which is why Fukushima is a worse disaster. So I decided we had to do something, and I was contacted by some people in Japan who said, what can we do? So instead of just moaning about it, we decided to do something. Now there are actually some things that we can do. The first thing we can do is we can actually measure the radionuclides ourselves, because frankly we do not believe what the Japanese government is coming out with. We don't think that they're right. I mean, I've measured more radioactivity in a car air filter than they are measuring in a child. And the car breathes air in the same way as the child breathes air, so I don't really believe what they're saying. That's the first point. So we need to have independent testing. And secondly, we need to try and do something about these children who are being contaminated. There are two things we can do. The first thing is we can take them away from the areas of contamination and put them somewhere where it's reasonably safe. But that leads us to another problem, because what's happening now, as I'm told, is that the Japanese government are trucking radioactive material from the Fukushima disaster area where it's contaminated all over Japan. And even as far south as the south of Japan, we're now getting reports of radioactive material being taken all the way to the south of Japan to be burnt. Now, what possible reason could there be for burning it as far away as that? I'll tell you the reason. It's really quite sinister and horrifying. The reason is this, that eventually when these children start to die from leukemia, from other cancers, from heart disease, from whatever, their parents are going to want to go into court. They're going to want to sue the Japanese government, and they're going to want to have to say, in order to do that, these children were contaminated, and that's why they've got high levels of cancer. But of course, the only way that they can say that they've got high levels of cancer is to have a control group in an area that's not contaminated. For example, the south of Japan. So I believe that the project to take this material and burn it all over Japan is to destroy all of Japan, is to increase the cancer rate in the whole of Japan so that there will be no control group to which you can compare these children in the Fukushima area. So that's that point. So we want to take the children away anyway into some safe area. That's what we want to do. But the second thing that we can do, and this is also quite important, is we can try and block the material. We can try and block the absorption of the cesium and the absorption of the strontium-90 and the plutonium and the other substances that are not being measured, incidentally. You have to wait a minute now because there's a train passing. I'm sitting on a children's playground here in Sweden. This is in Stockholm. And I decided to talk to you from here, from Stockholm, where there is a significant amount of radioactivity as well, I have to say, in the Baltic Sea. I measured this myself, but that's another question. So the second thing we can do is we can try and block the ingress of the radioactivity into the child's body. Now we know that we can do this with iodine, because iodine goes to the thyroid gland. We give them stable iodine, or at least we're supposed to. It turns out the Japanese government didn't. And then it stops the bad iodine, the radioactive iodine, from binding to the same sites. And you can do the same thing with the other radionuclides. For uranium and plutonium and strontium-90, which are the most serious, and all of which they're not measuring, incidentally, and none of which can be measured with a whole body counter, because they're alpha emitters or beta emitters, we can block their attachment to the DNA by giving large amounts of calcium and magnesium, which binds to the DNA and keeps the strontium and the uranium off the DNA. So that's one thing that these children can do. They can take a tablet every day of stable calcium. And so we are going to produce tablets which contain stable calcium, which we will supply cheaply at the cost of production to parents of these children, so that they can take these tablets and block the ingress of these substances. And we're also working on another tablet which will block the ingress of cesium-137. Now, in order to do this, we have set up an organization in Japan called the Christopher Busby Foundation for the Children of Fukushima. And it has a website, and it's all in Japanese, and it's all being done by a colleague of mine who contacted me from Japan, called James Grand. In addition to this, we are going to purchase a large number of highly sophisticated radiation measuring devices from Europe, from suppliers in Europe and suppliers in the Ukraine. And we're going to make these devices available to the parents of children to measure the concentrations of these substances in the food, and also to supermarkets, and we will measure the substances ourselves. We will set up a laboratory in Japan so that people can bring these substances to the laboratory and find out the truth about the concentration of radionuclides in these substances. So these are the things that we want to do, and we want you to help us to do this in any way that you can. This is an operation to save the children of Fukushima, because we do not believe that the Japanese government is doing anything to save the children of Fukushima. They are operating on a principle which is the principle of saving not the children of Fukushima, but the international nuclear industry. And this is disgraceful. Thank you for listening. I'm Christopher Busby. I'm an expert on the health effects of ionizing radiation, and I want to talk to you about Fukushima and Chernobyl. What I want to say is that the models that are used to determine the effects of radiation always concentrate on cancer and leukemia. And so the current risk model will say how many cancers are expected after Fukushima and how many cancers were expected after Chernobyl and so forth. But we know from Chernobyl that radiation causes a whole range of diseases, and one of the diseases that it seems to cause is heart disease. I want to talk to you about heart disease effects in children. Now, a colleague of mine, Professor Yuri Bandashevsky, became quite famous because he studied the effects of cesium-137 exposure to children in the areas that were contaminated by the Chernobyl accident in Belarus. He discovered, in the late 90s, he discovered that the children who were contaminated to the extent of having only 20 to 30 becquerels per kilogram, which is not very much, of cesium-137, were suffering cardiac arrhythmias, the heart wasn't beating properly, and they were suffering heart attacks and dying. And it's a very serious matter. So it wasn't a question of leukemia and cancer in these children, although that occurred as well, but there were very high rates of heart disease in these children. So the children were manifesting heart diseases which are normally only found in old people. And this got me thinking about how this could be at what appears to be quite a low level of contamination. So I started looking into this, and what I found is truly extraordinary, which I shall share it with you. The heart of a child is at the age of about 2 to 5 is about this size, and at the age of about 10 it's about this size. And we know from measurements that have been made how many cells there are in the heart of a child. A 5-year-old child has a heart which is approximately 220 grams in weight. A lot of it, of course, is blood. So if you take the blood out and just you leave the muscle tissue, there's about 85 grams of muscle tissue in the heart of a child aged 5. This is all data. Now we actually know also the size of the heart muscle cells. So we know how many heart cells there are in a child's heart. There are about 3 billion muscle cells in a child's heart. So this is a number, 3 billion. And what we can do is we can put 50 becquerels per kilogram of cesium in a thought experiment. We can put it into this heart muscle, and a becquerel is 1 disintegration per second. So we can see how many disintegrations, that's how many electron tracks come from this cesium-137 in a period of about a year. And when we do this sum, and it's really simple, it can be done on the back of an envelope, what we find is that there are many, many more electron tracks traversing the cells than you can imagine. And in fact, it works out that if only 1% of those cells were killed by the electron tracks from that level of cesium-137, if only 1% were killed, you would lose 25% of all the muscle cells in the heart. This is very serious because the heart is an extraordinary organ. The muscle cells in the heart are autonomous. They just contract and they contract and they contract for the whole period of the life of the individual. And every day they pump 7,000 litres of blood through the body. Truly extraordinary. And we live for 70 years. So this heart
beats away continuously for the whole of your lifespan. But of course these cells are non-replaceable by and large. It turns out that only 1% of these cells can be replaced in a year. So if these cells get damaged, or if a particular number of these cells get damaged, they cannot be replaced in a short period of time. So a year's exposure to 50 becquerels per kilogram of cesium-137, and incidentally, cesium-137 we know from experiments binds to muscle. So this is where it goes. Just like iodine goes into the thyroid gland and strontium goes into the bone and it goes to the DNA, cesium-137 goes to muscle. So it will concentrate in the muscle tissue of the heart. So this child's heart, after 1 year of exposure to that level of cesium, which is quite a small level, will have approximately 25% of its cells destroyed. Now, we would therefore expect to find effects, and the same effects that were found by Bandashevsky. And it does seem, from what people have been telling me about children in the Fukushima affected area, that they are actually suffering heart attacks. So, there are two things that follow from this, which are terribly important. The first thing is that children in that area should immediately be scanned using ECG, electrocardiograms. All hospitals have these devices, to see whether they have conduction problems, because the first manifestation of this damage to the heart muscle cell will be conduction problems, which can be shown on these ECGs. And in fact, this is how Bandashevsky found this. And incidentally, Bandashevsky, when he reported this, was sent to jail, and the government wouldn't believe it, and they said he was scaremongering. And so they sent him to jail. He was in jail for several years until eventually Amnesty International and the European Commission, the European Parliament, issued him with an international passport, one of only 25 that have ever been issued, and got him out of jail. So I worked quite closely with Bandashevsky, who is a hero. He received the Edward P. Radford Memorial Prize for Radiation Biology at the Lesbos conference, where he gave this paper that showed that there were these increases in the heart disease in the children. So the first thing that has to be done is that the children have to be checked out for conduction problems with an ECG.
Evacuated.
And and of course, if any of them are suffering from these problems, they should be immediately evacuated. But if any of them are suffering from these problems, then all of the children should be evacuated, because it means that there will be subclinical effects from this cesium-137 in heart muscle. And it will not be repaired. Heart cannot be repaired. Heart tissue cannot be repaired. These children will suffer for the whole of their life and will die young. Which brings me to the second point. The second point is this, is that if you die from heart attack or heart disease, you will not die from cancer. Because cancer is essentially a disease of old people. So you get genetic damage and it goes on and on and on. Eventually you get cancer. By and large, what happens is that the cancer rates go up very sharply as you get old. But I can tell you this, that the heart disease effects go up very much more quickly. So what you will find in areas like Fukushima that are contaminated with these radionuclides is not necessarily an enormous increase in cancer. There will be an increase in cancer, but you will find a big increase in heart disease. And actually when we look at Belarus, we find both of those things. We find an increase in cancer, but we find a big increase in heart disease, an enormous increase in heart disease. And as a result of this, the demographic index of the Republic of Belarus has fallen sharply after the Chernobyl accident, and now has gone into negative replacement. So in fact, if it goes on like this, the population of Belarus will disappear. And this is what we will expect to see in Fukushima. So I'm warning you all now to start looking out for heart disease, heart attacks, and keep getting the children out of there quickly. This is all simple stuff. You can do these calculations, and I've done these calculations, and I've produced a report which will be put on the internet shortly, and that you can have a look at. And we have also, the European Committee on Radiation Risk has also released early the Bandashevsky paper that he gave at the Lesbos conference, and that is on the website of the European Committee of Radiation Risk, which is www.euradcom.org, EURADCOM. So thank you for listening.
I'm talking to you today on Hiroshima Day about the question of human rights, science and the law. And in this I'm representing a new committee called the International Committee on Nuclear Justice, which was launched in Vilnius in December 2011 and later was added to by people from Geneva in May 2012. The purpose of this committee is to carry out and research legal avenues of preventing the continuing contamination of the environment by the nuclear industry and by weapons usage. And the first thing that we are launching today is a petition to the European Parliament, which is based on human rights legislation, and it's based on the fact that there is an enormous amount of information available now, peer-reviewed literature, scientific papers, which show that the contamination of the environment is causing the deaths of millions of people. And up till now, nobody has really thought about ways in which they can legally stop the nuclear industry and the military from continuing to contaminate the environment, because whenever they try to do this, activists and NGOs, and there are enough of those, and I'm talking to you all now, they get blocked by the argument that the risk model, the International Commission on Radiological Protection risk model, shows that these contaminations are safe and cannot possibly harm anybody. But there is now enough evidence to show that this is wrong. Scientific evidence in the peer-reviewed literature. And in the document that I should be sending you, and which you can find on the website of the International Committee on Nuclear Justice, which is nuclearjustice.org, you will find this document, which is a template for a petition to the European Parliament, which I will now explain. Now, this actually only applies to people who live in the states of the European Union. And later on we will be dealing with people who live in other countries like Japan and the United States, countries which have signed up to various international conventions on human rights. And we will be using human rights legislation. But for now, the first launch of this petition, this idea, will be through a petition to the Petitions Committee of the European Parliament, which I will now explain. You will find this petition on the website, as I said, of the International Commission on Nuclear Justice. And what I want you to do is to download the petition and to sign it. And if you like to add to it anything that you have that concerns you about the particular situation in your country, about nuclear industry, about contamination, possibly about child health, whatever it happens to be that is your concern, add that to the petition, sign it, and send it by registered post to the Petitions Committee of the European Parliament at Rouviers in Brussels, and we'll put the address up for you to do this. Now, I talked about this in Geneva, and I said there, when people were concerned about what could be done, that there was something that could be done. And if you all do this, it will cause a tsunami of petitions to appear. In August, and this is important because in August the European Parliament is in recess, and these petitions will have to just build up in the Petitions Committee, and they will have to deal with them. And the reason that they will have to deal with them is this: that the petition is based on the present European Parliament, the present European law, which is a directive based on the Euratom Treaty. It's the Euratom 96/29 directive, which is called the Basic Safety Standards Directive. Inside this directive is a clause, and I'll show you the clause here. It's written down under Chapter 5, Justification and Regulatory Control of Practices, and we're talking about practices involving the release of radioactivity to the environment. Article 20 says, existing types of practices shall be reviewed as to their justification whenever new and important evidence about their efficacy or potential consequences is acquired. Now, this is a terribly important clause, because what it means is that all of the practices, that's every situation where radioactivity is released to the environment, has to be reconsidered on the basis of evidence that shows that the risk model that is currently being used to address this practice, and this is the risk model of the ICRP, if it shows that this risk model is wrong or raises questions about its safety, then these practices have to be re-justified. And this petition will force that to come about, because it is law. So it's not just a question of complaining to your MP, it's not just a question of writing something saying, oh, I don't like this, on some vast tsunami of postcards that go to somebody who just puts them in the bin. This is a legal process which has to be dealt with, and they will have to deal with it. But only if you send the petition along. Now let me explain what this is about. Under international human rights agreements and legislations, there are various clauses which say that each person is entitled to live in an environment which is safe for their health. This has been universally signed up to by every single country in the world, and certainly by the European Union. Now the problem is that people who live in environments that are contaminated with radioactivity are not living in an environment which is safe for their health. And so this is a contravention of an international human rights legislation agreement. And the only reason that they can say this is the European Union, the Commission, in this particular case, that these things are harmless, is they can say that the International Commission on Radiological Protection says that the doses that are associated with these exposures are too low to cause any effects. But in this petition, at the end of it, we have gathered together 55 peer-reviewed references, each of which, on its own, shows that the ICRP risk model is false. And not false by a very small amount, but false by a very, very large amount, so that thousands of people are dying, no, millions of people are dying as a result of these exposures. People living along the shores of the Baltic Sea, people who are living along the shores of the Irish Sea, children who are living near nuclear installations. There's a long, long list. People in Iraq that have been exposed to radioactivity from uranium. I'll just go through a few of these because I don't want to hold you too long. The most important thing is this take-home message. You must get this petition, download it, and sign it and send it to the European Parliament at the address that we'll give you. So I'll just go briefly through some of the evidences, and they're all backed up by peer-reviewed studies. Firstly, there's childhood cancer near nuclear installations. An enormous number of studies have shown that if you live within 5 kilometers of a nuclear power station, your children have double the risk of getting childhood leukemia. There's no question about this. The radiation causes the childhood leukemia, and yet the ICRP risk model says that this is impossible. And the error in the model needed to account for these childhood leukemias, and the latest study is an enormous study from the German government. The error necessary to explain this is upwards of 1,000 times. So in other words, the risk model of the ICRP is wrong by at least 1,000 times in terms of, with regard to this particular situation. And now also here's another thing. There was an increase in infant leukemia after Chernobyl in those children who were in the womb at the time of the Chernobyl radiation. So it could only be the Chernobyl radiation that caused the increase in infant leukemia. And these studies were done in a number of different epidemiological settings, in Greece, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Belarus. Wherever anybody looked, they found increases in infant leukemia in these children who were in the womb. And that shows an error in the ICRP risk model of about 400 times. Then there was a study in northern Sweden by Martin Tondell that showed that people who lived in areas contaminated with cesium from Chernobyl had cancer rates proportional to the amount of contamination. This was published in the peer-reviewed literature. It's there for anyone to see. It shows that the error in the ICRP risk model is about 600 times. A very important study now is one by Hagen Scherb in Germany, and he looked at, and his colleague Christina Voigt looked at the sex ratio, that's the ratio of boys to girls who were born after accidents like Chernobyl, after the weapons testing fallout, and living near nuclear power stations, and he found that there was a perturbation in the sex ratio, quite clear, highly statistically significant, published in the peer-reviewed literature. It means that millions of children have died. Millions of children have died as a result of these exposures to ionizing radiation. That shows a problem with the ICRP risk model of hundreds of times, thousands of times. In fact, the ICRP risk model doesn't even consider the effects on infant mortality and children. So, we have cancer and leukemia, lymphoma and heart disease in uranium workers. Very recent study by Irina Guseva-Kano, who works for the French nuclear industry, incidentally. So not somebody from the, if you like, the lefty side, somebody who works for the industry. Very clever epidemiologist, has studied uranium workers and shown that they have a huge increase in heart disease effects and in cancer. in leukemia and lymphoma. This shows that the ICRP risk model is out by a factor of 2,400 times in the peer review literature. Various other things. I won't go through all of them. They're all on the end of this report. I'll just finally mention, of course, the work done by my colleague Alexei Yablokov, who collected together all of the information that came out from the ex-Soviet Union territories contaminated by Chernobyl, and showed that there were enormous health disaster effects in Belarus, in Ukraine, in those parts of the Russian Federation that were exposed to the Chernobyl effects, in Bryansk. There is just so much evidence. We have an embarrassment of riches, but the problem is that nobody will look at it. Well, we're going to force them to look at it by sending this petition to the European Parliament Petitions Committee with all of its 55 references, and you are going to help us to do this by contacting us at info@nuclearjustice.org, or else just going to the website and downloading the information. And I hope that you will contact us and tell us that you're doing it, so we'll have a sort of a list of the number of people who have helped us in this way. For the first time, we can probably make a difference. We can probably really stop the nuclear industry from continuing to pollute. And I don't blame these people. I have to say that we're not talking about bad guys and good guys here, although actually there are some bad guys. I think in general we're talking about ignorance and people who are tied into a sort of culture of physics and a culture of the past, a culture of a risk model that was set up in 1952 and hasn't really been altered since then. And so we have to forgive these people for what they've done, but we cannot continue to allow them to do it. Thank you.
Are you still sleeping? Are you awake yet? Wake up. Wake up.
Your written law, California law, United States federal law, NRC to enforce. By law, have to have somewhere to put the spent fuel rods. They promised us they would have the spent fuel rods taken care of by 1976, then by 1982, then by 1985, then 1991. It's 2013, you still storm on site.
The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant has become yet a renewed concern for the fate of life on our planet, especially in the northern hemisphere, which is of course strongly affected by the wind patterns of whatever radiation might be released from Fukushima. In fact, some are claiming that a very large amount of radiation has already been released, and by claiming I say that with a bit of satire because of course it's happened. Multiple meltdowns already happened, and that cover-up is being called Plume Gate. So just search that term if you want to learn more, Plume Gate. And now Senator Ron Wyden, who actually is a pretty decent guy. I used to live in Oregon in his district when he was a congressman. And I don't agree with all his politics, obviously, but pretty decent guy, really within the system. He tries to help people more than most, I would say. And he went out and visited the Fukushima facility to have a look for himself. And when he came back, he issued an urgent warning. He put it right on his own website, the government website, Senate website, and he said that it is a precarious situation, and he said that the entire facility is only protected from a second tsunami by something that he called the bags of rocks placed there, a makeshift wall, he said, made by bags of rocks placed there by hand. That's not going to survive a tsunami. That's not going to stop a giant tidal wave coming in. Not even a chance. Now, at the same time, a former Japan ambassador has gone on the record and made a statement saying that, quote, the fate of the world depends on reactor number 4. Those are his words. So there's been a lot of increasing concern about the spent fuel rods that are in the pools that are now have open access to the environment, and what might happen if there is a subsequent earthquake or a tsunami, which could happen theoretically at any time. It's largely unpredictable. What will happen? And to help answer that question is Arne Gunnarsson joining us today by Skype video, an amazing expert. He's been one of the most courageous scientific voices speaking out about the reality of what's happening in Fukushima, even as others try to cover up and downplay Arnie Gunderson has been actually reporting the truth from his website, fairewinds.com. That's F-A-I-R-E, winds.com. Did I get that right? Is that the right website?
You got it.
Yeah, okay. All right. Arnie, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on the Alex Jones Show. How are you doing today?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm great.
Well, it's an honor to have you on. You are one of the most widely known voices out there in the truth movement, and also among the scientific followers of what's happening in Fukushima. Can you begin by telling us what is your understanding of the current status of the situation in Fukushima, and in particular, reactor number 4 and its spent fuel rod pool?
I think you hit the nail on the head at the beginning of the hour here. The Unit 4 has always been, since the very first week or two of the accident, in my mind, the biggest concern. And the term I used a year ago was that if the Unit 4 fuel pool goes, we'll have Chernobyl on steroids. And I still believe that today. The problem with that pool is that there's an entire nuclear core's worth of hot fuel. And by that I mean physically hot, because it just ran. And 4 or 5 more years of spent fuel. The combination means that if it were to go dry, that it would burn and liberate an enormous amount of radiation. Brookhaven National Lab said that a fuel pool fire like could be experienced at Fukushima Daiichi 4 would kill 186,000 people from cancer.
Now, is that just a fire situation? If let's say the pool, the containment concrete cracks, the water drains out, or another earthquake happens, it all collapses. Is it a fire that releases that, or is there the possibility of it achieving again criticality or a meltdown scenario?
No, it can't. Low enriched fuel, like in a power reactor, has to have water around it to have a fission. For a chain reaction to occur. Now, what would happen if what I'm postulating is if there's a 7.5 earthquake and the pool cracks or the building topples, but let's say the pool cracks, the pool runs dry, the zircaloy clad, it would become hot enough to burn in air, and it's called a pyrophoric reaction. Once it starts, you can't put it out by throwing water on it because it takes the oxygen out of the water and just gets hotter.
So this would be like a massive dirty bomb essentially being set off, and it would just burn and release into the atmosphere, and then the wind takes it from there. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
So let me ask you this. If a terrorist group had this much nuclear material in their hands, how do you think America's response would be different? Because I find it interesting that this is essentially a dirty bomb, a ticking time dirty bomb, and America's doing essentially nothing. But if a terrorist had this much material, how bad would that be, Arnie?
We've been saying that here in the States, and I'm on record as saying that this type of reactor, this Mark I reactor, this fuel pool is up in the air about 100 feet high, and it's a terrorist target. And this isn't since Fukushima. I've been saying this for 10 years. The problem is if a terrorist were to broach the side of the fuel pool with some kind of a guided weapon, not a rifle,
like an RPG or something like that.
Yeah. That you would drain the pool here in the States, and it would create the same scenario. So this isn't something that the NRC and the nuclear community hasn't heard. They've just ignored it.
What's the deal with the other pool of stored fuel rods that's located reportedly about 50 meters away from this reactor number 4 pool? What's the interaction between those two pools?
The Japanese, unlike the Americans, have kept all their nuclear fuel in the fuel pool. So you've got a plant like Pilgrim with 37 years worth, whereas Fukushima only has 7 or 8. The Japanese took the fuel down out of these precarious pools when they got to 5, 6, 7 years and put them in a common pool. So they have an enormous common pool, but it's at grade level. So from a seismic standpoint, it's much more rigid. The Fukushima 4 pool is way up in the air, so it's like an upside-down pendulum in the event of an accident. In addition to Unit 4, and I'm clearly on record as saying both these, Unit 3 is not much better. So there's actually two fuel pools that could cause, certainly the evacuation of Tokyo would be plausible if that pool were to catch fire.
What about the evacuation of California? How much of a concern would it be if that pool, if the fuel rods in Pool 4 caught on fire, and that radiation was released, and all the isotopes, the iodine-131, the cesium-137, I think is a bigger concern. What, in your estimation, what is the range of possibilities of impacts on states like California, Oregon, Alaska, Washington, especially West Coast USA?
Yeah, well, first off, you're not going to find any iodine because that only has an 8-day half-life, so it's been gone for years. But the amount of cesium in those pools is roughly comparable to what's gone up in nuclear weapons testing, above-ground nuclear weapons testing for 30 years. I'm telling my friends that on the West Coast, you got to watch it like a hawk. Every day, go up and make sure Unit 4 is standing. And if it's not, we'll watch the plume, but have a plan B to move somewhere.
Well, that's great advice, Arnie, and I want to encourage viewers and listeners to visit your website, fairewinds.com. Again, that's spelled F-A-I-R-E, almost fairewinds.com might be the phonetic way to say it. But the problem with what you just said, or I should say the challenge, is that the mainstream media has already demonstrated it's going to lie about this. So if the average person out there in California, let's say, says, well, I'm going to watch CNN and I'm going to wait for CNN to tell me whether or not there's been a big release of radiation from Fukushima, isn't it possible that CNN may just never cover it, or they may downplay it, or the U.S. government may come up with some kind of weird cover story? Hasn't the truth already been manipulated so much that we can't really trust the media to tell us the future of what's going on there?
Well, I don't trust the mainstream media. Actually, though, I mean, CNN had me on 20 times, so they've done better than most of the others.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. That's actually to their credit to have you on then.
This is Major General Albert N. Stubblebine III, U.S. Army, retired. Through a lethal combination of greed, stupidity, poor planning, and I believe through a large dose of malicious intentionality, you and your family are threatened in a way none of us has ever encountered before. Knowing what I know, I cannot stand idly by without sharing both the danger, its cause, and a solution. I spent most of my 32 years of active duty in military intelligence, and I was preparing and acting on estimates of the situation designed to identify, appraise, and deflect threats before they occurred, or dealing with those threats once they did occur. This is my estimate of the current situation regarding the Northern Hemisphere. Fact: nuclear power was sold to us as a power source that would be so plentiful that it would be too cheap to meter. We were told that although no one knew what to do with the plutonium and the other disastrously dangerous waste produced by nuclear-powered plants, we would figure it out before we had a problem of any magnitude. And we were told that nuclear power plants were so amazingly well designed that they could not endanger us through mechanical or operational failure. All three of these fundamental premises have turned out to be manifestly untrue. Fact: on March 11, 2011, Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station with 6 nuclear reactors suffered cataclysmic damage from an earthquake, which some believe was a man-made event, and the resulting tsunami. Hydrogen explosions, at least one nuclear explosion, and then subsequent deterioration of the physical plants at 5 of those reactors have created a threat situation unparalleled in human history. Fact, despite denial and cover-up, the reality has emerged that enormous amounts of radioactive material has been spewing into the atmosphere, polluting the groundwater and the food of Japan, and entering by the tens of millions of gallons the waters of the Pacific. Fact, radioactive Fukushima debris is being trucked around the country to be incinerated in the open air all over Japan by the Japanese government, endangering not only the Japanese, but all of us by increasing the fallout, which will further contaminate the water and the soil of the rest of the northern hemisphere. Fact, measurements by the U.S. government and scientists at laboratories all over the northern part of the planet have been quite consistent in showing that increasing radiation is being found in milk, in spinach, in the drinking water, in the air, in the seaweed, and the fish, and just about everything else that has been measured. Fact, official, quote, safe limits of radiation were raised first by 100 and then by 1,000-fold, and the meaningless measurements of the, quote, no harm to human health, unquote, were repeated by agencies despite the fact that the U.S. government statistics showed clearly that in the first 9 months of the Fukushima disaster, fully 14,000 deaths occurred in the U.S. alone, which can be fairly laid only at the doorstep of the radiation reaching us from the escalating disaster.
The first radiation, the New York Times reports, is set to be hitting the Aleutian Islands today and the southern west coast of the United States, Southern California, tomorrow, with the jet stream set as it moves up and down, south to north, on a daily basis as the worst radiation comes in, moving more towards the north. Or it may stay on Southern California, and that is one of the worst case scenarios reported on Monday and Tuesday by meteorologists, is that if that radiation comes in, as you know, with the smog, with the mountains to the east of San Diego and Los Angeles and other areas, that it will trap the radiation over the city. If I lived, as a precaution, I personally, if I lived in Los Angeles or in that area, hemmed in by the mountains, by the high desert, where you have the jet stream that comes in and then builds up and then turns north there because of the mountains and runs up the mountain range, I would calmly be heading southeast. I would be going into Arizona. I would be going into Texas. I would be going into Mississippi and Louisiana. I will be honest with the audience. I am not leaving the United States. But I don't sit here and take a government that covered up Chernobyl, that covered up 3 Mile Island, when this clearly is now dwarfing it. Make no mistake, there's been multiple total meltdowns, fires in the reactors, fuel rods, 600,000 of them thrown every way you can imagine, fires in every containment facility. That place is a total nightmare. And what happens is you get moderate exposure, and then your child who's 8 years old gets leukemia when they're 18. Or your 2-year-old gets leukemia when they're 7. And we know, and this is even in the New York Times and Associated Press, that an estimated 1 million people in the last 25 years have died from complications in Europe from Chernobyl. In an article that is extremely detailed and extremely important by Paul Joseph Watson that must be gotten out to everyone, U.S. government cannot be trusted on radiation plume. We have the animated government map of what happened in 1986 in Europe. And if you're a PrisonPlanet.tv viewer, we're going to be playing that video over the audio while I'm speaking here. We'll start rolling that now, showing what happened in the 10 days after Chernobyl as it went out of Ukraine into Northern Europe, into Scandinavia, turned back west over England, over Germany, over France, and then settling in over Italy. For 6 months, the Italian government, I saw a comment in a news article, I pulled it up, it turned out it was true. For 6 months in Italy, they only ate frozen food from the United States and Asia. They would not feed in the schools, public and private, by government order, any fresh produce or milk products grown in Europe. And you can see the map on screen. All of Europe got a dose of it. All of Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia got massive dose, and that is only over 10 days. It then circled the Earth at measurable levels for another 2 years. The red area you see is guaranteed death within a week to a year. The orange area, they're talking about decades taken off your life. The yellow area, many years taken off your life, increased cancers. Just absolutely incredible what happened with Chernobyl. Now, remember, Chernobyl was a smaller plant that only had one explosion and then fires for a day and then another 8 days of steam rising out of the reactor 4. The other reactors there did not explode and were not damaged. 1 million dead in the 25 years since 1986.
First time since before last year's March earthquake and tsunami, a nuclear reactor in Japan is up and running again, despite 200,000 protesters gathering last week in central Tokyo to demonstrate against turning any nuclear reactors back on. Reactor number 3, at the oil nuclear plant in the Fukui prefecture in western Japan, was officially flipped on Sunday night, restarting Japan's embrace of nuclear power. Many of the other 49 reactors that have been shut down since last year are scheduled to be turned on again later this month, but scientists are warning that the plants still haven't been properly upgraded to withstand a strong earthquake and tsunami like the one that took out the Fukushima plant, which is still in the midst of a nuclear crisis. Last week, record levels of radiation were discovered inside Reactor 1 at that plant. A lethal dose of more than 10,000 millisieverts an hour was registered in the reactor. That's 10 times more radiation than in reactors 2 and 3. According to the operators of the plant, TEPCO, workers are unable to enter the site due to the high levels of radiation. So is it really wise for Japan to be restarting its nuclear plants while the country is still trying to resolve the world's worst, what may well be the world's worst nuclear disaster? Here to offer his take on this is Paul Gunter, director of the Reactor Oversight Project at Beyond Nuclear. Paul, welcome.
Hey, thanks again, Tom.
Thank you. First of all, is this yet the world's worst nuclear disaster?
Absolutely. This is it's a disaster that is still unfolding. First of all, we're still concerned that Fukushima Unit 4, even Tokyo Electric Power Company now has admitted that 2 of the walls are bulging out underneath this elevated fuel storage pond with 135 metric tons of nuclear waste. So we're still in progress of an accident that could yet unfold into even a larger catastrophe.
Wow. We just saw this radiation spike at Fukushima Reactor 1. What does that mean?
Again, we have inside these reactors, the radiation levels right now are even frying robots that are trying to get in there. So it's a lot of guesswork, a lot of calculation, but in fact what we have is an accident that's still out of control at this site in a number of units.
And in your opinion, has Japan, and for that matter, the opinion of the majority of the Japanese people, has Japan actually taken the necessary steps to prepare these 49 reactors that they're bringing back online over the next month?
Absolutely not. In fact, what is now coming out is the fact that Kansai Electric Power Company has been repressing the fact that the unit that's just come online, OI, has an earthquake fault underneath it. So the disclosures are showing that you can't trust the government and nuclear power. And in fact, I think that what we're seeing right now is evidence that there is a cultural shift in Japan that is not going to return to business as usual.
Yeah, I think you're right. What's the situation with regard to the Fukushima radiation that's showing up in the United States?
You know, we've known all along that hot particles have been in the atmosphere from the accident, and they continue to precipitate. I think the problem is that we don't really have enough information, and our government is not providing us with adequate monitoring for not only rain or what's in the food, but we're going to see a series of independent studies that are going to give us better indications of what is actually the fallout situation here in the United States.
There are groups around America that are independently monitoring.
There are academic studies that we're monitoring right now that we believe will be giving us a good idea of things like radiation levels in mushrooms, which are biological accumulators of radiation, and all along the West Coast we're going to be seeing the news. And we'll certainly be looking forward to sharing that with you.
Yeah, I remember I lived in Germany the year after Chernobyl melted down. In fact, we moved there the month that Chernobyl melted down. And it was the mushrooms that you could walk through a supermarket with a Geiger counter and they...
Those are early indicators because they do concentrate it. Yep.
Yeah, wow. Anything in particular... Well, actually, I want to get back to reactor number 4 at Fukushima. You said this is... Just to reset this conversation, this is a 10-story building roughly?
Yes.
That has in the roof of it all this nuclear waste.
Yes.
And the building is now sagging.
It's a 40-foot deep pool, 6 stories up in the reactor building, above and outside primary containment. It contains about 135 metric tons of nuclear waste, and just last week it lost cooling to the pool, which luckily it was restored, but what we're seeing again is this very iffy, sketchy patchwork of safety systems that are prone to failure, and
if
they're
this
not.
thing goes, it could be Chernobyl.
These things are not seismically rated, and we're quite concerned that any sizable earthquake could just set this whole accident afire again.
This has become like a house of cards, just waiting for.
Nuclear power always has been a house of cards.
Now we've been covering the nuclear disaster in Japan, and not only the damage and suffering there, but the slow and inevitable drift of radiation into the atmosphere and landing here. So far it's been detected in 15 states across the U.S., all the way from the West Coast to the east, and all the while we've been told these are minute, trace amounts that pose no harm to any of us. But now the EPA says traces of radiation have been found in milk. Again, they say far below levels of public health concern, but that won't stop some public concern. It's where we begin tonight with NBC's Tom Costello in Washington. Tom, good evening.
Hi, Brian. The U.S. has already halted imports of dairy products and produce from Japan, but radiation travels in the air, it falls on pastures and meadows, and it appears to have been consumed already by American cows. 4,700 miles from the nuclear disaster in Japan, the faintest hints of radiation have now turned up in America's milk supply. Trace amounts of radioactive iodine-131 found in samples taken from California on March 28th and Washington State on March 25th. But levels so low, the EPA says a sample taken from Spokane would have to be 5,000 times higher to reach levels at which the FDA would intervene.
For parents out there, this is a speck of dust. You should not worry about it, and the worry itself will be far worse than the dust of radiation we're talking about.
The radiation most likely blew in from Japan, fell over the countryside, and was consumed by cows. Still, despite the assurances, some skeptical parents are concerned.
When they tell me not to worry about anything, I probably wouldn't trust it completely. You can't really trust anything these days.
Earlier this week, the EPA reported it had found very low levels of radiation in the air over Hawaii, Alaska, California, Washington State, Idaho, Nevada, even Alabama. But it urged Americans to keep it all in context, saying, quote, "Radiation is all around us in our daily lives, and these findings are a minuscule amount compared to what people experience every day."
We're seeing potential levels that are perhaps 100,000 or even a million below any level of concern. Our system monitors the air continuously in the United States.
Still, nuclear opponents say it's all a concern.
Since we're at the end of the food chain, it represents a risk if these amounts continue to rise.
Iodine-131 has a very short half-life, only about 8 days, which means it loses half its strength every 8 days or so. And we're reminded again today that just flying in an airplane or standing out in the sun exposes us to radiation every day. Brian?
Tom Costello starting us off in our D.C. studios. Tom, thanks.
Yes, but do you understand that Fukushima has been going now for 2 years without stopping?
At the site. No. It's still a ticking time bomb. Realize that after the big Sumatra tsunami, 90 days after, 3 months after that, there was a huge aftershock. If they have another aftershock, and they're not in cold shutdown yet till next year, the accident could start all over again. It's like hanging by your fingernails. Yeah, it's stable, but you're hanging by your fingernails.
Americans think this crisis is over, or that some even think that maybe it's solved or it's contained. It's not. What's happening right now?
In the last 2 weeks, everything we knew about that accident has been turned upside down. We were told 3 partial meltdowns, don't worry about it. Now we know it was 100% core melt in all 3 reactors. Radiation, minimal that was released. Now we know it was comparable to the radiation at Chernobyl. And as far as evacuation, 12 miles, that's it. You don't have to evacuate beyond 12 miles. Now they find hotspots, 4 hotspots outside the evacuation zone. 34,000 school children now have radiation badges when they go to school.
Kindergartners with radiation badges.
Down to 4 years of age. Can you imagine that? Kindergarten kids with radiation badges going to school. So all the mythology of the accident has been turned upside down because utility has finally fessed up to how severe this accident really was.
In your view, did they not know how bad it was, or they knew and they didn't tell, or they just were completely blown away by the scope of the disaster?
I'm a physicist, and we tried to reconstruct the accident in our computers given the feeble amount of information they gave us. We knew it was much more severe.
Did they not know how bad it was, or they knew and they didn't tell, or they just were completely blown away by the scope of the disaster?
I'm a physicist, and we tried to reconstruct the accident in our computers given the feeble amount of information they gave us. We knew it was much more severe than they were saying because radiation was coming out left and right. So, in other words, they lied to us. They knew how much radiation was coming out. They knew the danger. They knew how much core melting was taking place, but they tried to put a happy face on it.
As a reporter, within hours of the earthquake and tsunami, within hours, not even a day, there were already statements from the company and from the International Atomic Energy Association saying that there had been safe shutdown of all of the reactors. And we know, of course, in the end that simply wasn't true. But from the very beginning, they were trying to tell us that this was a safe situation.
Within hours of the accident, we now know it was like the Keystone Cops. People that are clueless, headless, just running around crazy, not knowing what to do. We can now reconstruct that accident minute by minute, hour by hour, and we can see this chaos that erupted in the leadership of the utility.
What's happening to the people who are working there now?
Well, as you know, workers are being sent in, and they're getting, like a year's dose of radiation just within like 10 minutes at a time. At Chernobyl, 600,000 workers had to be mobilized, each one going in just for a few minutes, each one getting a medal from Gorbachev.
This will be the 100-year cleanup. How long will it take to clean this up, in your view?
50 to 100 years.
And we're not there yet. We're not to the point of talking about the cleanup yet because they haven't stopped the reaction. It's still happening.
Cleanup hasn't even started yet. They're not in cold shutdown till next year. Cold shutdown is when boiling stops.
Right.
It's boiling water right there at the reactor, releasing radiation into the environment and releasing radiation into gigantic vats.
How are they storing and disposing of this stuff?
That's the killer, because they have all these vats that are filling up now. They may have to dump it into the ocean again. At that point, the Chinese, the Koreans, the fishermen, they get up all in arms because there's so much damage that every time you put water in, it leaks right out again, highly radioactive, and it's filling up at the site now.
So what do they do with it?
Right now, they're just counting the number of gallons as they pile up, desperately trying to bring more vats in. But once they saturate, they're going to have to dump. And at that point, it's another crisis.
Let's talk about the radiation in the environment, in the atmosphere. We've been told that it would be measurable but minuscule amounts on the U.S. West Coast, around the world. Is that true?
It's still minimal around the world. Most of the damage is concentrated within 20 miles, 50 miles of the reactor accidented site. That's where we have the hot spots. That's where we have 20 times normal amount of radiation in schoolyards outside the evacuation zone. But in New York City, you can actually see it in the milk. You can actually see that the iodine 131 actually spiked a little bit in our milk in New York City, but it's very small.
Just even hearing that, though, I mean, even hearing that you can detect it, that there's a catastrophe that is the worst catastrophe, industrial catastrophe in history, that we can see it in milk in New York, that's frightening.
That's right. This could be the granddaddy of all industrial accidents, topping Chernobyl at 200 billion, topping the Gulf oil spill at about 15 billion, topping the Challenger Columbia disasters in space at about 10 billion. This could be the world's record holder for an industrial accident.
How many...
is Japan tsunami debris may soon hit California coast. Now what's funny about this article is they're telling you and warning you that the debris from the tsunami that slammed Japan is on its way to the west coast, but what they fail to mention is also the radiation that's coming along with it. Now this article was posted on February 13th, 2012, and I'll read some of it here. It says, at this very moment, up to 25 million tons of debris occupying an area roughly the size of California is on a collision course for the North American west coast. The floating wreckage, often called floatism, is a result of the massively destructive 9.0 magnitude earthquake that struck just off the coast of Japan last March. Now, if you scroll down, they just go into a little bit more detail about all the debris that's coming. But they also include a video here of the debris that's come off Japan's coast. Now, you got to think, when you're watching this video, think about the radiation in the water. So, pretty much, this is the wreckage they're showing. But think about the radiation that's there as well. And watch this 14-second video, and it'll show you exactly what I'm showing you, how that radiation is going to hit the west coast. See, just like the radiation fallout, that's how it went in the water. But they're saying this is the debris. Hits the west coast, goes up, goes down. It covers the whole west coast. So what do you guys think that's going to do to our waters when it does hit here in a couple months? Now, guys, I'm going to take you to a website that talks about all the dead fish and sea life that's been dying in this area. And again, like I said, it's not just... As before I take you to the mass animal death website, I'm bringing you a news article from Business Insider Military and Defense. The headlines for this is the Army is stocking up on ton of anti-radiation pills to protect its troops. Dated for April 10th, 2012. I'll just scroll through here and read a little bit of it. It says, while checking out the Federal Business Opportunities Network, we come across a listing by the Defense Logistics Agency, the Troop Support Branch, seeking to supply potassium iodine tablets. Scrolling through the online solicitation, you'll see that the U.S. Army Medical Material Agency want to ensure critical operational forces are protected in the event of a nuclear fallout. The FDA recommends taking potassium iodine in radiation emergencies to block out cancer-causing radioiodines that would otherwise be absorbed into the body's thyroid, the gland in your neck that regulates adrenaline and metabolism, along with doing a bunch of other stuff we need to survive. And it says the U.S. has bought potassium iodine tablets in the past and now is looking ahead to scenarios possibly spurred by last year's Fukushima crisis. Now just...
The March 11th earthquake and tsunami. It was deposited along the coast during rainstorms and found its way into kelp beds along the coast of California. The elevated levels of iodine 131 were deemed non-harmful to humans, but could affect sea creatures that feed on kelp.
Using some in these tubes in your cortex, but most mutations are deleterious. They cause disease. Very few are advantageous to survive in a difficult environment, but they occur over billions of years. And what we're doing by increasing the level of background radiation in our food and our air through nuclear power and Hanford and the like is increasing the number of deleterious mutations. Now, interestingly, I've been saying this for years, yeah, we all carry several hundred genes for disease, like diabetes and cystic fibrosis, my specialty. There are 2,600 genetic diseases. You all must listen to this, it's very important. But the other day, my son was diagnosed with hemochromatosis. Hemochromatosis is a disease which is an abnormality in iron metabolism, and you collect iron in your tissues, and you can get cardiomyopathy. It destroys the heart muscle. You can get cirrhosis of the liver. I, therefore, carry the recessive gene for hemochromatosis. He could have knocked me over with a feather, and so does my ex-husband. Isn't that fascinating? It's called a Mendelian recessive. And normally Mendelian recessives take about 20 generations for the two of them to get together to express the disease, like diabetes or cystic fibrosis or hemochromatosis. There are the dominant ones, like the achondroplastic dwarfs, you see, who have normal trunks and very short arms and legs and big heads. That's a dominant. And at Children's Hospital in Boston, I once saw a family. Mother was normal, father was an achondroplast. They had 5 children following in their wake, 4 of whom were achondroplastic dwarfs. So it's a toss of a coin each time, Russian roulette. Okay, so as we fill up the environment with radiation, so we're going to increase, well, we're damaging the very building blocks of life, and most people don't understand that. And they are passed on generation to generation to generation. That's the thing. Once you do produce a mutation, if you reproduce, it will probably be, 2 of my children are carriers. My daughter won't get herself tested, and she's a doctor. She's a bit difficult, as daughters are wont to be. Now, so I didn't finish the xenon, krypton, and argon. These are xenon, krypton, and argon. They're called noble gases. They're gas because they don't combine biochemically in the body. However, if you inhale them into your lung, they are absorbed through the alveoli, and they're very fat soluble. And where are the main fatty tissues of the body? The abdominal fat pad and the upper thighs. And what is located in that area? The gonads, the testicles and ovaries. And they're very high energy gamma emitters like X-rays. So people who live near nuclear reactors, if there's an inversion system, and these things are emitted all the time, they could be enveloped in a cloud of xenon or krypton or argon, inhale it and damage their genes. Okay? And also their regulatory genes later to cause cancer. What you also should know is children are 10 to 20 times more radiosensitive than adults, but little girls are twice as sensitive than little boys to getting cancer, and that we haven't talked about that much, but we don't know why. We don't know why. Now, what else comes out routinely? Tritium. Tritium is H3 instead of H2. And it's used in exit signs, it's used on watch dials, it's used on airport signs for the planes to see. It is a tiny, very active molecule. It gets out of every single container except gold, because gold is so dense. It'll escape from stainless steel, glass, plastic, you name it. So you can't contain tritium. And the nuclear industry says, it's only radioactive hydrogen. Well, it combines with oxygen to form tritiated water. And, you know, there are often fogs around nuclear power plants and full of tritiated water. And this tritium actually can get right through the skin. Now, the skin lets nothing through because it's the most important organ of the body. That's why when you get a burn, you get so sick, because you lose the protective mechanism. It also is inhaled into the lung and also bioconcentrates in the food chain, and you can't taste it. And it's nasty stuff because it combines in the DNA molecule. It's highly mutagenic. It's a soft beta emitter. And I write all about it in this book. And there's a huge literature written by the nuclear power industry because they're scared of tritium, but they say, don't worry, it's really okay. It's only tritium. It causes brain tumours, muscular tumours, well, it causes cancers in many organs. Okay, that's tritium. Carbon-14 routinely released, and its half-life is long, I can't remember, thousands of years. The half-life of this one is 12.2 years. That means if you start with a pound of tritium in 12.2 years, you have half a pound. In over 12.2 years, you have a quarter of a pound. It decays exponentially. Do you see? Multiply that by 10 or 20 to get its total radiological life. Each reactor releases 1 million picocuries of tritium a day. A million picocuries of tritium a day from its cooling pools and from the reactor. Now, that's very interesting because Germany, and you know how studious and didactic the Germans are, studied children under the age of 5 who live within 5 kilometres of the reactor. 5 kilometres, what is it, 2.5 miles? It's 16 old reactors, and they found that the children under the age of have double the incidence of leukemia and a high incidence of cancer. That's because of the tritium.
Hello to all. Alex in Tokyo.
Written law, California law, United States federal law, NRC to enforce. By law, have to have somewhere to put the cement fuel rods. They promised us they would have the cement fuel rods taken care of by 1976, then by 1982, then by 1985, then 1991. It's 2013, you still store them on site.
Hello to all. Alex in Tokyo, the 2 April 2011. Well, I will continue to report what I hear here, and that won't be long anymore because I planning to move from Japan as soon as I can, so probably in 2 weeks time, hopefully, I will not be able to give you any news from Japan because I will go out of this country. The place is dangerous for centuries now. So well, the news yesterday, I didn't give you news because we had no news. That's it. Okay, the whole story is totally covered now since the beginning, but more now. And since, as I mentioned a few days ago, French experts and American experts are here now, they will not want to share their secret to the world, first thing. And second thing, 2 days ago, remember the IAEA declared that 40 kilometers outside the shelter, the security shelter, some village should have been evacuated because the level of radioactivity was already twice higher than the evacuation level. They announced it officially. So, I mean, even in Japan, it was official, so everybody, all the Japanese hear this, that it was official, and right after, the next second, the government said, the Japanese government said to his people, to the Japanese people, IAEA asked for evacuation on some area, but we, Japanese government, say we don't need to evacuate. This level of radioactivity is not harmful for an immediate health problem. So you see, we are now in this. People just seems not to understand, and not only Japanese, everywhere it's the same. The people have been told that some radioactivity level which is now very high, for example, what they call now sort of normal radioactivity level in the shelter of security, it's like millisievert or something like that, and they just say, don't worry, this is not dangerous for you Japanese people, because this level of radioactivity is about the same as 1 year of natural radioactivity. Okay? But what they forget to say, it is that this level, you get it every 1 hour. So if you get 5 millisievert in 1 hour, then if you stay 2 hours, you're going to get 10, and so on every hour. So in 1 or 2 hours, maybe you will have 1 month or 2 months of natural radioactivity, or maybe more. So you make the count, 24 hours per day. So in 1 month, you might have 10 or 20 years of natural radioactivity into your body. Okay? So everything seems to be like that. It's not seems, it is now. So, no news yesterday, no news today. Well, yes, some info. So some people will call me a liar probably. Yes, we have flash information about 1 minute, 1 minute. And so, yes, Japanese people will probably say, we have a great news today. It's true, we have something new, a new desperate solution. Now, the Japanese government say since 2 days that they are using a resin, a resin, sort of resin that they're going to pour on the soil. This resin should take the radioactivity. Just everything is okay, everything is desperate. The water, I've seen this, it was yesterday, the fresh water is brewing in a Fukushima plant by American boat. So they take fresh water from another part in Japan, and they put it in a boat, and the boat come in Fukushima to bring this fresh water. So, everything is desperate. Now they are pouring resin. I don't know if my accent is it's understandable. Resin, something look like a paint, and so this will dry in 24 hours, and probably this will catch all the radioactivity. So Japanese people around 50 kilometers of the Fukushima plant, don't be worried, because everything is under control, as they told us, as the government say, as everybody say, everything is okay. All right. So now, since there is always people who will have trouble to understand, even with the pictures of Fukushima plant. I'm not going to make a slideshow right now. Some friends in France sent me real, very high quality pictures of Fukushima plant. I don't do a slideshow. You can find this picture on the internet. Well, who in this world will see the Fukushima plant pictures, and who will be able to deny the fact that 4 reactors have blown? There is no building, there is no more wall. We can see the reactor from the sky. You can find the pictures, okay? Everybody see this picture. They are available. We can see the green, a green box where the reactor is. There is no building. The spent fuel was here on the roof, on the pool roof. There is no roof anymore. So, who cannot see this? Are we all stupid? Honestly, there is no roof. We can see what left from the reactor. The melting down already happened. So, why, after the evacuation recommendation from International Atomic Agency, why the government in Japan say, no, we are not going to evacuate, we are not going to extend the security shelter? And everybody seems okay with that. Come on, guys, let's wake up. Tell me what's the difference between Chernobyl and Fukushima. I am asking to those specialists, what is the difference? Well, even a children can understand this, even a children. Chernobyl, 1 reactor melted down, 1. Fukushima, 4. Well, 10-year-old kid can understand this. We have in Chernobyl 1 reactor, we have in Fukushima 4 reactors. We are melting down, and 1 or 2 is already melted down. So, what is the difference between Fukushima and Chernobyl? It is that Fukushima has a probability of at least 4 times worse than Chernobyl. Yes. So you know, some people think the core explosion didn't happen in Fukushima. But even you've seen on TV, you've seen on the internet, all the explosion here, 3 with the black smoke. Well, make a tea at home, boil some water, tell me what is the color of a steam. It's certainly not black, okay? So this black stuff that we have all seen during the explosion were already probably the fuel or, you know, something, not the steam at all. Who believe it's steam? Come on. Come on, wake up everybody. What the hell is going on this planet? Who can say that Fukushima is nothing compared to Chernobyl? Come on. Of course it's not compared to Chernobyl, because it is worse, as I said since the start. Okay? So now, the International Atomic Security asked for evacuation. The Japanese government refused to evacuate. The Japanese government refused to extend the security shelter. And now, since 2 days, nothing accurate will come, okay? Because, again, something very simple to understand to everybody, even for those who are going to say, you know, that I lie. Man, even for you, I will say something very easy for understand. All of you who call me an idiot, for example. Well, you are not a lot, but still, I want you to understand something. Chernobyl. When this happened, I was already 16 years old, so I remember like if it was yesterday. Maybe you wasn't born at that time, but try to understand this. 25 years after, Chernobyl is still radioactive. We cannot live in the area. Okay, it is a ghost area around Chernobyl. 25 years after for 1 reactor. Here in Fukushima, we have 4 reactors. So, how anybody can expect or believe that the area around Fukushima will not be radioactive for at least 25 years? Because Chernobyl is still radioactive. Why will it be different here in Fukushima? Tell me why. Just, you know, try to be smart once in your life. So, now everything is covered up. Nothing will be accurate from now. They are still, they are still lying more and more. And so, as I said at the start of my video, I'm gonna leave Japan, because I have no other choice now than, I cannot stay, because this area will be a dead area. It is already, and the more I stay, even in Tokyo, 200 kilometers, and I am in North Tokyo, this means 150 kilometers from the nuclear plant, staying here for 10 more years. I don't feel it's a good idea. So I do my best to move now, because I hope it's not too late already. Now they are covering that the level 7 of Chernobyl is reached in Japan since many days already, and they probably now need to put level 8 on the scale of the nuclear disaster, because Fukushima will be worse than Chernobyl, and a lot of experts agreed on this.
Written law, California law, United States federal law, NRC to enforce. By law, have to have somewhere to put the spent fuel rods. They promised us they would have the spent fuel rods taken care of by 1976, then by 1982, then by 1985, then 1991. It's 2013, you still store them on site.
From the Duke City, Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the studios of KKOB, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie, and welcome to Coast AM. Open lines follow just a bit later tonight. And by the way, got to do this. Happy anniversary. Saturday, it's my parents' 62nd anniversary. Absolutely amazing. And I'm only 35. How does that happen? Here's what's happening. Federal officials, lawmakers, and a lot of other people are a little concerned, according to doctors too, as they are rushing to find remedies for critical shortages of drugs to treat a number of life-threatening illnesses, including bacterial infection and several forms of cancer. The proposed solutions, which include a national stockpile of cancer medicines and a not-for-profit company that will apparently import drugs and eventually make them, are still in the early or planning stages, but they sense a widespread alarm. So far this year, at least 180 drugs that are crucial for treating childhood leukemia, breast and colon cancer, infections, and other diseases have been declared in short supply. It's a record number. In a moment, Dr. Robin Falkov joins us live. We'll talk about this and some other stories.
If we're short on drugs, then maybe people will be turning to safer alternatives. But it doesn't make sense.
I just can't believe we're short of drugs. To me, it sounds like a sham.
Well, yeah,
to try to make more.
Well, yeah, to drive up the prices. Create a demand. People will be in panic, and we have to get our drugs, and they're fearful, and oh my God, and like the vaccine scams that they pull.
Last night when we were on the air in Los Angeles, it was earlier in the day in Japan. They had another earthquake, 6+, and I'm saying to myself, oh no, another tsunami possibility. You're still following and you're still monitoring the situation that occurred months back when Japan was hit with that huge tsunami that caused so much widespread disaster and deaths. What's going on with radiation? I had a story earlier last week, Robin, that said that in March, we got hit with radiation on the west coast of the United States, but they never told us how bad the situation is. Scientists are saying, no, not to worry. We got hit, but it's not that bad. What's going on with that?
Okay, we're 161 days into this, and it is quite bad because we've been lied to. I mean, how can they justify telling the people of the United States that they're going to monitor once a month because there's no danger when we know that this whole area where the Fukushima reactors are have been emitting radiation? And the latest report that I just was going over today.
Hot off the presses, huh?
I mean, yeah, truly hot off the presses, and I have not had time to verify this, but this is what is being reported, that there are cracks opening up in the ground, and they're comparing this to the Jane Fonda movie with what happened when it sank into the ground and everything started opening up, but there's steam coming out, and there's so much smog that people can't really see what is happening, but the measurements are showing, and
these are measurements in Japan.
And this is what is mind-boggling, George, because this is so extreme. The recommended safety level for people with, let's say, x-rays or travel is 100 millirem per year. They are stating, and remember this is not verified, they are stating that this is 1 million millirem per hour. So they're supposed to be covering the reactor areas over with tents.
Now, I don't know what that means numbers-wise, but anytime I hear 1 million, to me it sounds big.
Well, if you're looking at 100 million per year, and we're talking about 1 million an hour, I mean, it's mind-blowing. It's insane that this is not being covered here. There's been a media blackout on this, which you know happens with all of these big stories. They claim they don't want people to panic, but it's quite questionable. Are they worried about the lawsuits? Are they worried about people rioting and getting really upset, as they should be upset? They should be relocated.
When do people see symptoms of radiation poisoning if it's in this kind of level capacity? Does it happen months, years from now?
It can happen in days if they're getting intense exposure, nausea. Their skin can be burned, open ulceration, digestive problems, hair loss. I mean, it depends upon the intensity of their exposure, so it can be quite sudden.
When this report came out last week that some states had been hit with higher levels of radiation, it wasn't a series of states in chronological order geographically. They seemed to be scattered all over the country. I found that to be confusing. I would think every West Coast state would get hit, but it was sprinkled. I mean, there was a little bit of Massachusetts. It was all over the place. Why is that?
It could be the wind currents. It could be how high those states are, the altitude for the areas that they're talking about. And then are we talking about projections or are we talking about actual measurements? Because getting those actual measurements is really challenging because that's the information they don't release. There is the nuclear radiation website, and people can go there, see live time reporting from people around the country.
Accurate?
Supposed to be accurate. Right. And when it reaches over 126, then you've got to be worried. So far, I haven't seen those levels in the States, but they did claim months ago that California got pretty high. La Jolla, they're saying now had high levels. Oregon, Alaska. My gosh, they said Alaska had very high levels in Canada.
Robin, I don't want to leave people hopeless. Well, I mean, what can they do?
What can they do? Well, the
can't walk around in radiation suits.
No. And their precautionary method of using potassium iodide, I came on Coast and went over the caveats for that with the audience, and I urge them to go to my site and read through that information. Don't panic. And the danger from the radioactive iodine passes. It has I think a 6-point-something lifespan before it breaks down and it's not a hazard. But if you take the potassium iodide, you can't be taking birth control pills, you can't be taking so many other medications. You've got to be really careful. You can have seaweed, you can have chlorella, spirulina, you can have these, different sea vegetables, but the challenge now is that there's so much of the seaweed that came from off Japan. Which part of Japan? Can you trust the people selling it to not just try to make a profit and sell contaminated seaweed as they've done to the people there with contaminated rice and beef?
Written law, California law, United States federal law. NRC to enforce. By law, have to have somewhere to put the cement fuel rods. They promised us they would have the cement fuel rods taken care of by 1976, then by 1982, then by 1985, then 1991. It's 2013, you still store them on site.
It is time to remove the incompetent and obsolete nuclear industry, which is in place right now. There must be a new industry, a nuclear energy, if we are to continue with nuclear energy. And may I suggest that I guess I could be the head of HR, because I know what this industry needs. A brand new crew. that's not incompetent nor obsolete.